Buongiorno, io sono Don Robert Sirico. Sono nato agli Stati Uniti, però i miei antenati sono da Italia e ho voluto salutarvi un po' in italiano. Come vedete non posso parlare correntemente in italiano, ma ho voluto salutarvi all'inizio di queste discussioni di libertà e religione. What I'd like to do for the three segments that we have is to discuss liberty and religious belief. And for the first part, I would like to discuss whether or not the idea of religion is a threat to human liberty, and perhaps to give some definition to what we mean when we speak about liberty. And then to discuss various themes that connect the liberal idea with the religious idea. So let me begin with the question that many people, especially here in Europe, but also increasingly in the United States, the question that many people ask is liberty compatible with religion in general and with Christianity in particular? I think the arguments to the contrary are very familiar to most of us. It has been said that since the Enlightenment, religion is a threat to liberty. The attachment to religious dogma is seen as a threat to the choice that people will want to make with how they live their lives, and preconditions a culture to accept a measure of despotic control in place of freedom. We see this bias even in the language that describes this debate. At least in the English language, an atheist is said to be a free thinker, whereas a believer is thought to be bound or shackled by tradition or creed or dogma. The arguments for the unity of freedom and unbelief are common cultural currency. We are told that faith makes us subservient to authority. It makes us unwilling to think for ourselves, so that we become tribal or collectivistic. We don't demand our rights against the state because we're always thinking of the hereafter. In fact, it was Marx who indicated that religion anesthetizes people. He called religion the opiate of the masses because it allows people to live with the pain of alienation and in the here and now of capitalist exploitation, as Marx would put it, and disables them from reacting and creating a revolution. Marx's idea of religion was that it anesthetizes people. It acted as an opiate because people think of heaven rather than the conditions that they confront here and now. It is said that believers turn the other cheek when they are hit, so that they are more easily ruled with an iron hand, somewhat like the way God rules the entire universe. And it is said that religion brings about conflict, because people argue about tiny points of doctrine and end up killing each other over those tiny points of doctrine. Or perhaps it was most clearly stated by Rousseau: Christianity preaches only servitude and dependence. These views characterize what I think is a mainstream position of the educated elite today, people who regard sneering at believers as a mark of high learning. My thesis and my argument is precisely the opposite of this. And to demonstrate it, let me first address the whole issue of authority. The core religious claim of the West, and I speak here of Judaism and Christianity, is that our loyalties are to God first and to earthly authority only secondarily. This might at first be seen to be a controversial claim. It certainly is contradicted by the civic ethos of the ancient world, in which the state and faith were one, the divine Caesar, the divine ruler. And this was precisely why the ancient world so distrusted the Jewish people. They could not trust the Jewish people because the Jewish people refused to give their first obedience to the emperor. They would only bow to God and were willing to suffer persecution and even death rather than to bow to the authority of the emperor. The Jewish people had their own law, their own courts, their own standards of justice. They had their own culture that existed within the broader culture. These constituted a sphere within the culture that would not and could not be finally submerged within the collectivist civic project. One thinks of the 76th Psalm, terribili et ei qui afrit spiritum principium terribili apud omnes regis terrere. Make vows to the awesome God who takes away the life of princes. He is greatly feared by all the kings on the earth. Now, what can we say about a religion that sings such songs? It is a safe assumption that such a group would not be the most beloved of an aspiring tyrant or a political class. It was precisely the unwillingness of the Jewish people to obey without question that led to their social and cultural marginalization in many cultures. It was their desire to be free of tyrannical control that led to the decisive events in Jewish history. So too was Christianity born in the refusal to surrender mind, heart, and soul to the state. Buried deep in the Christian memory is that rather than to submit to Caesar, the Holy Family fled to Egypt. Indeed, some of the most striking words in the accounts of Jesus' life occur when he was handed a Roman coin. And he looks at the coin and he says, whose figure is on this coin? It was a coin to pay taxes. And he looks at the coin and he says, whose figure is on this coin? And he's told, Caesar. And the famous line of the gospel that sets a whole series of thought in motion when he says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but unto God what is God's. Here is the assertion of two realms, the civic and the theological. This is why Christianity in itself, in its core belief, could never ultimately be a theocratic arrangement. In this concept, both the law and the civic magistrate are to be respected and even prayed for. But at the core, at the most fundamental level of our being, within our souls and in our moral convictions as well as in our hearts, we are not owned by the state. If the moment arrives when we are forced to choose, we choose allegiance to God over allegiance to the civic realm. This allegiance is achieved for ourselves by a free act of our wills, and it is to be proposed, not imposed, to others because its very essence is freedom. It is precisely for this reason that Rousseau, somewhat in contradiction to his claim that Christians were natural slaves, Rousseau regarded Christians as bad citizens and terrible warriors. He says, quote, the gospel sets up no national religion. A holy war is impossible among Christians, close quote. From this insight, Rousseau suggests that the decline of Rome was brought about by Christian conversion. He said, when the cross had driven out the eagle, Roman valor wholly disappeared. For this reason, Rousseau further argues that anyone who claims that the church is the source of salvation ought to be driven out of the civic realm. What is really at issue here is the problem of authority. is there a single source of state authority, or is there another belonging exclusively to God, which claims adherence based on internal conviction that people have, and which is a form of restraint not based on external coercion, but on interior assent? That is the question that confronts us with authority. The claims of the state may or may not coincide with the will of God, and what is God's alone may be withheld from the state. This idea might not strike us today as very radical, but at times when we consider the separation of church and state, we have to think that it was not always a social given. It was not always accepted as the norm. In the ancient world, we saw a very different approach. When Jesus drew a sharp line between God and the state, suggesting that they are not unified and that the interests do not always coincide, he was developing and refining Jewish thought and experience. This would initiate first a deep Christian appreciation of freedom, which would evolve into the fact of freedom, into institutions of human liberty. We see this again in the title of a foundational work in the history of the West. I'm referring here to St. Augustine's The City of God. This is a book that should be studied by every student of the social sciences, philosophy, and of course theology, because it is here that we find the core idea that would lead to the emergence of a new form of civilization, one in which the state would not reign supreme on earth. St. Augustine saw that civil authority was not the final authority. Civil authority was not infallible. Indeed, the civil authority, characterized by its possession of the means of coercion, is not populist by impeccable people who are born without original sin, but rather by sinners who will be judged by God just as everyone else will be. This is another reason for our caution with regard to the expansiveness of the power of the state and the necessity to limit the state's power in human affairs. This, drawn from Christian doctrine, is the need for all people to be redeemed. And this, in a sense, was a new form of egalitarianism. It places all people on the same level in need of redemption. All men will be judged by the same standard of morality and justice. That includes even the most exalted leaders. After death, they will not continue their earthly status. And the rulers will not become gods themselves. No matter how much ermine they wear or how many jewels they own, every monarch will one day have to shed all of their riches and face God as a simple human being. Now, this raises another striking aspect of the Gospel's narrative, and that is what I would call its individualism. But perhaps a better word for that is its personalism. This takes into consideration, the reason I prefer the word personalism over individualism is that personalism is a richer word. It takes far more into account than just a kind of atomistic individual. It includes that part of the person that is distinct and unrepeatable and in a certain sense autonomous, but personalism takes in a fuller concept of who human beings are. And we see the Gospels being addressed to individuals, to human persons. And in being addressed to them, it is presumed that they possess a certain free choice over their lives, over their beliefs, their morals, and their earthly and eternal fate. As a religious leader, this was Jesus' primary pedagogical method, perhaps even more so than his miracles. He appealed to reason. He counseled war, not peace. War, rather than, we have to go back. He counseled not war, but peace, not swords, but persuasion. He did not seek earthly power, Indeed, his own followers were confused on this very point. As we know from the gospel accounts, when he was threatened, they wanted to create a revolution. He was greeted as a would-be king, and they urged him to take his rightful place as the king of Israel. But Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." The power of Christ was of a different sort. This power was essentially threatening to the state precisely because of his refusal and that of his most intimate disciples to succumb to the power of Caesar. Christ was killed by the state, a fact which became a central symbol and driving reality for the band of followers that he would leave behind. The nascent church followed Jewish tradition by creating their own structures to manage their own affairs, eschewing the institutions of the state. Early on, the church had systems of charity, and very early on, various kinds of judgment that would take within the church itself, rather than appealing to the state. Christians were to avoid going to court with one another, rather settling their disputes among themselves. They developed their own law and courts with a hierarchy serving as a governing structure over their belief systems. The state would come to be seen not as a part of the structure of that authority, but only worthy of obedience insofar as its dictates accorded with a higher moral sense, what would come to be called the natural law, but not as the origin of authority and not as the source of law, much less morality. In the Christian concept, man is always prior to the state. The state exists for man and not man for the state. Nor was Christianity satisfied with an insular social status. Its social vision sought to change the whole world. And because it was inherently evangelistic, this was a religion that was open to all people, inviting all people into its fold, without regard to one's ethnicity or economic status. It was the church's very universalism, its Catholicity, that led to the concept of social and economic mobility and eventually to a concept of universal human rights. This view of humanity went contrary to the idea that people are somehow stuck in the condition and class of their birth, or rather can by their own free will. This view said that people by their own free will can adopt a new vocation and become new people, new creations, both in one's heart as well as in relation to the world itself. Where the state favors strict hierarchies of command and rigid structures of social and economic status so that it can better control people, the church said that people could take on various vocations, adopt new professions and abandon old professions. They could become priests or nuns. Even the simplest peasant could one day become a pope or a bishop. So progress and change are ideals that are integral to the Christian faith. Another trait of Christianity that made it unique was its emphasis on reason. Whereas the religions of the Far East saw God as formless and incomprehensible, a writer by the name of Rodney Stark says, Tertullian, Aquinas, and many other church fathers were defenders of reason. Clement of Alexandria, for example, wrote that, quote, "It is not safe to commit these things to bare faith without reason, since assuredly truth cannot be without reason," close quote. It was the dialogue between faith and reason that enabled Christianity both to look to transcendent sources of moral authority rather than earthly sources of moral authority, yet still be concerned with concrete social realities. So Christianity's universalism, its emphasis on independent thinking, and its evangelical strain are precisely what have led totalitarian governments from the time of Herod to present-day leaders in North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and China to use every means available to suppress it. Fundamentalist communism was atheistic not because it was essential to the ideology, but because it required it of its practice. If the state was to own all and rule all, an authentic and independent Christianity had to be crushed, because Christianity in this sense was subversive to the totalitarian state.